But it's a complete lack of leadership. Politicians just do the polling, see what the polling says, and do what the polling says. Oh, no, we can't do that. It will be too unpopular. We can't do this because the public will vote against us. I mean, the public are fed up. The public know politicians are doing this. And the politicians, in reacting the way they're doing, are creating more and more problems.
My good friend Alexander Downer, with whom I served for many years in government, is, in fact, to this day, the longest-serving Australian Foreign Affairs Minister of all times. He was always a very clear thinker, always very realistic, always very upfront, and was highly effective in that role and is highly regarded to this day internationally for the job he did. He also served for 4 years as Australia's High Commissioner to Great Britain, living, of course, in London. Alexander, thank you very much for joining us. I should disclose that I regard you as a good friend. We sat beside one another for a decade. You even there a bit longer than I was in Cabinet. That was a very long time. And your perspectives as the Foreign Affairs Minister of I think you would call, and I would agree, a significant country, are, I think, very important. And you've continued on. You've spent a lot of time in London as our High Commissioner there. So I thought I'd ask or begin by asking you a helicopter question. As we look at the world today, do you agree with those, and there seem to be quite a few of them, who are saying we're living in the most dangerous time since the 1930s?
Yes, in some respects I do. It's very, very hard to make those sort of judgments, obviously, and you can debate them. But in some respects, I think it is the most dangerous time since the 1930s. If you like, I think there is a risk of world war, the like of which there hasn't been since the end of the Second World War, although you could say the Cuban Missile Crisis was one particular point, but I don't think so. And the way a war could develop is that with the Ukrainians and the Russians bogged down in Ukraine, the West continuing to support Ukraine, albeit that support beginning to flag a bit, which is significant. And secondly, the Middle East, particularly what's called the resistance, the Palestinian resistance or the Arab resistance to the Israelis, and then over to the east, the South China Sea and Taiwan issue. You could put them all together in a catastrophic scenario. So the Middle East could spread. Iran could decide to unleash Hezbollah and to the north of Israel and unleash Palestinian resistance on the West Bank, coupled with their continuing support for Hamas, leading to an American intervention as Israel's situation became increasingly desperate, and the Chinese taking advantage of that. Because one of the things the media don't cover this very often, but you have to realize the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians are all talking to each other the whole time. They're in constant contact. They know exactly what each other are doing. And they do work together in a kind of loose alliance. And if they unleash this loose alliance against the West, then, and that could happen through accident, if you like, through miscalculation. The Iranians could overreach in their support for Hezbollah and other groups that they do support, like the Houthis. They could overreach. That could lead to the Americans having to become involved. And at the same time, the Chinese could opportunistically see this as a way of introducing, perhaps to start with, a modest blockade of Taiwan, as America is distracted in the Middle East and in Ukraine. And in those circumstances, the Americans would have to do something about the blockade of Taiwan as well. So I spent a lot of time talking about this. There is a scenario, so I'm not saying it's going to happen, there is a scenario where you could end up with a really major war. And the way to resist that is to make it perfectly clear, the West, to make it perfectly clear that we will be ruthless in prosecuting our interests, not that we will be half-hearted or uncertain, which is what we've been over the last 20 years.
Well, that immediately raises the question of whether America and the West in general, but America in particular, in its current frame of mind, is prepared to go on backing the Ukrainians. And we're seeing a great standoff in Washington at the moment over debt ceilings and whether or not any more should be done for for the Ukraine. It could well be that heralds a new age of isolationism by the Americans, a world weariness, and that seems to be something that the right, or the right wing of the Republicans in particular, threaten us with. And now we've got a rerun that looks like between Trump and Biden, and Trump says, well, he'll resolve the question very quickly. But my concern would be that if the West loses its willpower, you've just talked about that, and that's evident in a backing off of support of the Ukraine, that really only encourages other troublemakers.
Well, this doesn't start right now. This has a history of a gradual weakening of American power and American resolve, coupled with a weakening of broader Western resolve. I mean, on the broader Western front, you've got the Europeans who have not been investing heavily in defence, with the possible exception of the British. But more in a way, more seriously, has been the extraordinary series of policy failures on the part of the Americans. So I go back a while. I go back to the sort of 2008, 2009 period, when there was an uprising in Iran called the Green Revolution. There was a very substantial, one's forgotten this, I suppose, but very substantial protests in Iranian cities, in particular in Tehran, against the theocracy, with essentially the educated middle class and particularly women demanding liberation. So in came the Obama administration, and instead of giving moral and intelligence and the like support to this insurgency in Iran, the Obama administration announced that they wanted to negotiate a so-called nuclear deal with the Iranians. And the Iranians played them at a break, really, for several years until they did cobble together this deal. But throughout all of that time, the United States policy towards Iran, which is the country which was even then arming the Houthis, supporting Hezbollah, supporting Hamas, causing havoc in Iraq and in Lebanon, the United States is negotiating a deal with them which will free up Iranian assets. So what message, I mean, you can go into the detail of that, but what message does that send to the Iranians? It sends a message that America doesn't have the resolve in order to put pressure on Iran to stop the nefarious activities by Iranian-backed bodies in the Middle East. And this is incredibly dangerous. Okay, Trump came in. Trump had a policy of was called maximum pressure on Iran. But no sooner had Trump left office than Biden came in. And Biden came in and resumed these negotiations over the nuclear deal and started freeing up Iranian assets. I mean, I spent a lot of time talking about Iran, but the United States sent out a message of lack of resolve, lack of determination to crack down on what's essentially a rogue state, which is threatening the security of a very sensitive part of the world. The Biden administration also spent a lot of time attacking the Saudis and denigrating Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia, who is a reformer and has historically been very pro-West. And Saudi Arabia has been a bulwark against Iranian power. But under the Biden administration, they started attacking the Saudis. There was this issue of the murder of the columnist, Washington Post columnist Khashoggi. Okay, now I'm not defending what the Saudis did, but the Americans decided that that was a geopolitical issue and that they would throttle back their support for the Saudis. They also were very critical of the Saudis for the way they conducted the war against the Houthis in Yemen. All of this, I'm sorry, I spend a lot of time on it, John, but all of this has transmitted a message of weakness by America. And there are two other things which I think were really focused on by President Putin and Xi Jinping in China. One of them was Obama's red line in Syria.
Yep.
When he decided in the end, you'll recall, not to proceed with action against the Assad regime for the use of chemical weapons, having said it was a red line. And that was serious. That was a significant blow to the United States prestige. The British Parliament also voted against any intervention in support of the Americans in those circumstances. So this sent out a very negative message about Western resolve. But then more seriously than that was the sudden withdrawal from Afghanistan, which I thought was absolutely catastrophic. It wasn't just that it was a shambles. I suppose any withdrawal in a short period of time is going to involve a certain amount of, shambles. But it sent a message of lack of American and lack of, Western, but particularly lack of American resolve. And I know from talking to people in the British and American intelligence communities that Putin and Xi Jinping saw this as a very clear message of lack of American resolve. So I spent a lot of time going through all of those things because I think it's really important to understand the context of where we're at. So would Putin ever have invaded Ukraine if the Americans had shown more resolve through those previous years? Would Iran still be doing what it is doing and creating huge pain in the Middle East if a policy of maximum pressure had been maintained on Iran? And would Xi Jinping still be threatening to take Taiwan, and particularly not by a D-Day landing, but by some sort of blockade, throttling Taiwan? Would he be doing that if the Americans and their allies had shown huge resolve over the last few years? So I think that's the problem we have. And the only way, of course, you can't change the past, but the only way to rectify that is now to show huge resolve, to double down on support for the Ukrainians, to get back into a policy of maximum pressure on the Iranians, and to make it perfectly clear to Xi Jinping that we want to coexist with China and engage with China, but an invasion or blockade of Taiwan would be a casus belli. So don't even think about it. And the Americans can't just say this themselves. The Americans have to be backed up by their allies, showing exactly that same resolve. I mean, the British are fine. The French pretty much on the right page at the moment. But the European Union countries the Western European Union countries have shown great weakness over quite some years, and they need to strengthen their position.
Resolve will reflect itself in capability, I would have thought. And I understand the British Empire at its height used to maintain the view that they had to be able to maintain, if necessary, two major conflicts and a minor one at any given time. We've assumed the Americans can do the same. The reality is, though, that, of course, not only is there the question of resolve, as you've put it, and the messages we've sent, it's gone hand in hand, it seems to me, with a declining commitment to defence. I mean, if you take America, we assume that they're always going to be able to look after us. There have been substantial real cuts in defence expenditure. The army is considerably smaller than it was in 2010. The Navy says that to be effective and to do the jobs asked of them, which is presumably 2 major fronts and a minor skirmish somewhere, they would need 350 ships. They're below 300 and they will slip further this year. And they'll only build 1 Virginia submarine, not the 2.5 or so. That's of great importance to Australia. So in the face of all of this talk about dangerous times, you're seeing the lack of resolve you're talking about, but it's also extending to a loss of capacity, which has to be a major concern.
Yes, and so there's an increasing focus on that. I would say, to try to take, as you call it, a helicopter view of all of this. The problem has been that since the end of the Cold War, we might say 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, policymakers have basically, particularly politicians, have taken up that Francis Fukuyama slogan that we've reached the end of history, that we don't need to spend so much money on defence anymore. So there was a winding back of defence spending, the so-called peace dividend. That was replaced with spending, ever-growing spending on welfare programs and health programs, which, let's be honest, are reasonably popular with the public. Well, I'm sure not that defence spending is unpopular, but there's nothing more popular than expanding entitlements, regardless of how they're funded. And so there has been, in most Western countries, a very substantial increase in expenditure on welfare and health. And that, of course, when we need now to spend more on defence, has left little room to spend money on defence. The best example is the UK, although the UK spends over 2% of GDP on defence. But, they've been reducing the size of the army. They've been reducing the size of the Royal Navy. So their capacity is somewhat diminished. So people say they should spend more on defence. But the problem is they spend so much on their National Health Service. I mean, they spend 44% of their budget on their National Health Service. In the case of Germany, which has been spending barely 1% of GDP on defence, Chancellor Scholz has now agreed to increase very substantially German defence expenditure. It's only they can't, because constitutionally they're not able to expand their deficit. And, of course, the public won't allow them to increase substantially taxes because the Germans have spent all their money on welfare. And green initiatives, by the way, are incredibly expensive. So it would pay to have a look at what these countries are spending on renewables and the so-called energy transition. And it just leaves little scope for increasing defence expenditure. That's the problem you have. And you can see that with the Americans and the debates in the US Congress. Yeah, sure, a lot of people would like to spend more on Ukraine, but a lot wouldn't. And, a lot of the people who wouldn't would rather spend the money on welfare or whatever it is, securing the southern border and so on. So this is a huge problem. And yet the West, I think, is gradually waking up. So there's a cause for some cautious optimism here, is gradually waking up to the need to increase defence expenditure. Of course, it's not just the dollars and cents you spend, it's the capacity that you invest in, but in building that capacity. And they have been very struck by their incapacity to continue to supply Ukraine with shells, missiles, other hardware, and replenish all of that in their own countries. That has become quite an issue for them.
There are other aspects to this problem of how you afford more on defence. Not least of all is that, you and I pride ourselves on having belonged to a government that actually obliterated Commonwealth debt, and Australia is one of the very few Western countries that still has a reasonable balance sheet. I wish government sense would recognise that they stand on the shoulders of the work that we did, because none of them have done much about it since. But the debt to GDP ratios across Europe, Britain and America are truly horrific. And you've got a double whammy arising out of modern approaches to all of this. One is nobody's got the heart to do anything about cutting back expenditure, doing anything about budgets. And the result of that is not only are these debts exploding, but now in America, I think they're already spending more on interest on their debt than they are on defence. In Australia, the fastest rising, even faster than a National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is eating its head off, the cost of the budget of interest on our relatively modest debt is now the fastest growing bottom line item. Britain's, as you've already described, is very serious, and it really limits countries' options to do the things they ought to do to secure their futures going forward. The other thing you touched on, though, is that we're approaching a lot of our policy issues now in relation to the environment where you're pushing manufacturing, which is wealth creation and also critical to defence, offshore. Indeed, you're sending a lot of it from the West to the very place that seems to despise our freedoms. Where's the logic amongst our leaders today?
Well, I think we'll come back to the quality of leadership in the Western world, but I think there's been a woeful lack of leadership and explaining to the public these kinds of issues. Because don't think the public is silly. They know that you have to get the money from somewhere, but if you don't make an issue of where you get the money from, they won't be focused on it. They'll just be focused on the entitlements and the benefits. But I don't think, dare I say it, I don't want to sound like a climate denier. I'm happy to explain my position on climate change, but if you go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, what triggered the Industrial Revolution was access to cheap energy and the development of cheap energy. It started over there in Somerset in England. So England became the founder of the Industrial Revolution because it had cheap energy, which was coal in those days. And what the West is doing as it addresses, as it sees it needs to, the issue of climate change is pushing up the whole time the cost of energy. That is the cost of doing anything. And you quite rightly say the cost of manufacturing, the cost of living, the cost of heating and cooking and all these basic things, pushing up the cost of transport. These costs are continually going up. And as a consequence, you have productivity flatlining. And if you look at in Australia's case, productivity actually declined in the last year. In the UK's case, it's flatlined. In America's case, we can come back to that, but there is some improvement in productivity. But then America has very cheap energy, and that's maintained a policy of relatively cheap energy. It has much cheaper energy than Australia or Europe. So we powered up the price of energy and invested eye-watering amounts of money in renewables and the energy transition. I know there's an argument for all of this, but the downside to it is that it's economically crippling. And it's okay if you think the most important thing in the world is to stop the world warming and you think you can stop it warming through this method and nothing else really matters, then it's the right thing to do. But if you worry about increasing productivity, encouraging investment in Western countries, if you worry about that increased investment being able to fund the various entitlements that have expanded so substantially, then you will try to balance more carefully the investments you're making in green energy and the energy transition. I'm on to all terms. you will try to balance that with your broader economic objectives. But actually, what politicians are doing, I mean, it doesn't matter whether they're the centre left or the centre right, they're going around kidding people that through a whole series of government subsidies and government expenditure, we can achieve some sort of renewable energy miracle. Well, I mean, it's clearly not true. That's clearly not happening. And that's not happening in any of the Western countries. So, the Western economic model, particularly outside of the United States, has stalled. But in the United States, they've been doing much better because energy is so much cheaper there. So you have to examine very carefully what has been happening to the cost of energy, and all at the same time, Western governments have been increasing expenditure on entitlements. You make the point about the NDIS. In Australia, it's going to become our NHS. I mean, it's politically a third rail. If you decide to rein in the expenditure on the NDIS, presumably by restricting eligibility, you are inviting a howl of protests. In the UK, the NHS is just a completely unsustainable model, and in the end, it will just collapse. But for the time being, it hasn't, although it's got a bit near to it. But if you say to people, well, higher income people should make a contribution for the cost of a GP visit or whatever it is, there should be some co-responsibility introduced. Howls of protest destroying the model, politically untenable, and so on. Well, I never think things are politically untenable. I always think in the end, if it's a good idea, you can, and it's good policy, you can explain it to the public. Don't assume the public is silly. But it's a complete lack of leadership. Politicians just do the polling, see what the polling says, and do what the polling says. Oh, no, we can't do that. It would be too unpopular. We can't do this because the public will vote against us. I mean, the public are fed up. The public know politicians are doing this. And the politicians, in reacting the way they're doing, are creating more and more problems. I mean, people see their real living standards in Australia. Real living standards have actually been declining. In the UK, they've been declining. In Western Europe, I mean, Germany has been in a recession. It's been declining. I mean, politicians say it's all because of Ukraine. Of course, it's not all because of Ukraine. That's absurd. It's all because of the way they are diverting resources into green green policies and entitlements, hugely increasing government expenditure when you don't, and overall GDP expenditure, and we're investing in things that don't yield a positive return. You don't make money out of them, so you're not creating wealth. And wealth creation, it's not seen as such a good thing anymore. I mean, company taxes have been going up in the UK, company taxes have been going up in the US. In Australia, our company taxes are very high. What's wrong with investment? What's wrong with people making profits? And it's the taxing of the profits which will help to fund the entitlements. And that kind of logic seems to escape politicians. I think we have very poor political leadership throughout the Western world, and I think that's very sad.
An observation that I would make is that the breaking of trust is a huge problem, and you've touched on it. But it seems to me that it's, if, as you say, you really do believe that the only priority of any substance at all is to reduce emissions to achieve that target of 2050 and the interim targets, 82% reduction, I think, here in electricity generated emissions by 2030. In a democracy, you're absolutely free to hold those views and to argue them. The massive problem comes when you're not honest about explaining to people that it will mean a significant reduction in the way we live. It will mean it. It's a binary choice. And it's this lack of integrity. The public smells a rat, but they're constantly given weasel propositions that don't stack up. And I worry at what point societies like ours start to disintegrate because there's just not enough trust anymore.
Well, I'm not sure about disintegrating. I think that's probably been too pessimistic. But I mean, we're sort of enthusiastically agreeing with each other here. I think the public do smell a rat. I think you're finding this throughout the Western world. And because the politicians have been pursuing, they actually have come from the mainstream political parties pursuing populist policies. That's what they've been doing. Because they're popular, they've been doing these things that I've been talking about. The public see that there are a lot of problems and a lot of unresolved issues. I mean, why are my living standards actually declining? So we don't have a problem with unemployment, but we do have a problem with declining living standards. I mean, that is a huge issue. Why are migrants coming to our country illegally, and why isn't the government doing anything about it? And the answer of politicians, there's a former German foreign minister called Joschka Fischer, who I'm very friendly with. He's a Green. Joschka Fischer was discussing this with me late last year. And I said to him, yes, but what is the German government, the Greens are part of the German government, what is the German government doing about illegal immigration and about the rising cost of energy causing a recession and falling living standards in Germany? And he said, well, these are complex issues and the public don't understand that these are complex issues. And I said to him, well, if your answer to something the public is concerned about is they are complex issues, they'll look for somebody who does have an answer. Telling somebody an issue is complex is not an answer. And I mean, I think this is happening throughout the Western world, that the mainstream politicians are simply not addressing the issues because they think it might be unpopular to do it. And populists, they're called populists, but other political parties, new political parties and political movements are beginning to emerge. And my advice to mainstream politicians is level with the public. Tell the public what you can and can't do. There are some things you can't do. So tell the public about that. There are some things that are difficult to do where there are trade-offs. So let's just say climate change. Australia contributes 1.3% of global emissions. So if we spend another, $20 billion building more renewable energy, offshore wind farms and huge expense on transmission lines and so on, I say to people, well, fair enough, but just tell me, given Australia contributes 1.3% of global emissions, just explain to me, for all that expenditure, what impact that is going to have on the global climate. Just explain that to me. And if you can prove to me that that's going to have a significant impact on the global climate, then I might be prepared to go along with the expenditure. But the answer to that question is obvious. So it's like Snowy Hydro 2.0. I know that was a Liberal or coalition initiative, not a Labor initiative. Well, I think it's just a complete waste of money. With transmission lines included, it's going to cost over $20 billion. Okay, it sounds good, but it's zero emissions or almost zero emissions. Just explain to me what impact that is going to have on the climate. It's totemic. It's symbolic. It's not going to have any practical impact. In the case of the UK, its emissions, CO2 emissions, are now at the same level they were in 1879. 1879, that's how high or low UK emissions are today. And they won't publish the figure of how much they're spending on the sort of green transition, but they are spending tens of hundreds of billions of pounds on the green transition, they contribute just 1% of global CO2 emissions. If you want to address global CO2 emissions, you need to focus on somewhere I was in the last couple of weeks in India. You need to focus on the huge emissions that are coming out of India and China, not be destroying productivity, economic growth, and the capacity to fund entitlements in Western countries, which have already been substantially reducing their emissions. But, the public are kind of onto this. Politicians are promising to spend eye-watering amounts of money on green initiatives, which will make no measurable difference to the global climate, according to the scientific models that they like to quote. So, the public are onto this.
So, presumably, what is needed is leadership, and there's a pent-up desire, I think, for that. But would we be prepared to embrace a Lincoln or a Churchill or a Roosevelt who said, this is not going to be easy, I can only promise you tough times, we need to make major changes? Are our people, do you think, in the West capable of embracing the need for really significant change that might actually involve some painful adjustment?
I think they are. And I think that is, I actually think that is why they're veering, or some of them are veering off and voting. Why do people vote for Trump? All right, people don't like Trump, and Trump is terrible, and he said terrible things and done bad things to women, and his language is appalling. I understand all of that. But why? It's not 10 people. It's half the population of the United States want to vote for Trump. Why did Geert Wilders win the Dutch elections a few months ago? Why, as Alternative for Deutschland, characterized as a far-right party, it certainly has some far-right support, why are they polling so well, particularly in the eastern part of Germany? Why did Giorgia Meloni become the Prime Minister of Italy? And why are we seeing mainstream political parties like the French Socialist Party almost completely disappear? It's because these political parties are not addressing the issues the public are concerned about, and they're not leveling with the public. Level with the public. Be honest with them. You can't afford continually farming money out for entitlements by borrowing more and more money and think that that's sustainable. Politicians love to use the word sustainable, but their economic models are not sustainable. So I personally think it's a world which is just waiting. It's just waiting for leadership. And I do think this includes our own country. I think in Australia, the political parties have been going along with this European-style model, and they've not been levelling with the public. Level with the public about NDIS. Tell the public that don't tell the public your political opponents are callous or isn't the NDS a great achievement and so on. It's nice to look generous to people with disabilities. I accept that. And I'd like to feel that I was kind towards such people. But there's only so much you can do. There is only so much you can do, and there's only so much you can afford to put into that scheme. And level with people. Tell them that. Tell them that we've got to start. We've gone too far with eligibility for the NDIS, and we're going to have to scale it back because its budget is just getting completely out of control, and keep arguing that case. Level with people about climate change initiatives, what effect they're having on the climate and what effect they're also having on the economy. Level with people about it. And on immigration, I know stopping illegal immigration, because we've been so involved in this issue, and I still am in the UK. I know that there there is no perfect solution here. It's what academics call a wicked problem. But I know that. So level with people about the problems associated with stopping illegal immigration, but the need to do it. Because if you don't stop it, the public will vote for somebody who will. So you might as well address the issue yourself. I think this is a great moment for great leadership, but where it will come from, I can't. You'd hope it would come from, first and foremost, from America. But honestly, what a choice. What a choice.
Well, that's really probably, that was at the heart of it, but it's not just America. Everywhere it seems that people are looking for clearer, more honest leadership. And you touched on immigration. I mean, you had the Brexit vote. That was about the British people saying, we want to determine who comes to our country and under what circumstances, to use an expression from John Howard. You will know, we both remember him using that expression. But of course, the forces of progressivism. I know you don't like the left being called progressive because you say there's nothing progressive about it. I remember you saying that to me very definitely. But you know what I mean by that. They immediately say, oh, well, the British people are racist. The people who voted for Brexit are racist. They say nationalism is a bad idea. Patriotism is a bad idea. Nationalism is a bad idea. We should do away with boundaries. But I actually think that the people, are really onto this one. And here in Australia, we are now running the highest immigration programs of all time. Of course, it's strongly defended because it makes it look as though the economy's growing when in per capita terms, we're in recession. People are not imagining it. Their living standards are going backwards. And here we have another example. But I'd really appreciate your views on this, because I think you would mount a strong defence for a right form of nationalism. You would say that, properly expressed, patriotism is valuable not just to a community and a nation, but indeed to the globe. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
I'd separate the terms patriotism from nationalism, because nationalism goes to an ideology. But patriotism, yes, people are patriotic and they expect their leaders to be patriotic. And just thinking of John Howard, that was one of the characteristics of John Howard. He talked up his country. He loved his country. I remember this of Malcolm Fraser as well, Bob Hawke. These prime ministers embraced patriotism. They loved Australia. Australia was the greatest country in the world. I mean, whether it is or not, you can have an endless debate about that. I think in a lot of ways it is actually. The most successful country that the world has ever developed. You can make that argument, and you expect our leaders to do that. But no, they slag off at our history, the history of shame, colonialism, exploitation. I mean, obviously things have gone wrong. There have been people who have ended up in jail. Governments have made mistakes, but that's true everywhere. It's true in Burkina Faso and in Argentina as well as in Australia. But it's just that you would expect our leaders to embrace the huge success of our country, and they do not. That is the same in the UK. One of the reasons why Tory voters are getting really sick of the Tory government is that, and one of the reasons, by the way, they loved Boris Johnson, is because he wanted to put the great back into Great Britain. I mean, Britain has wonderful history, the huge achievements in science and technology, the spread of democracy around the world, all this sort of stuff. We should be proud of our history and proud of our country, proud of our values. It would be good if a British Prime Minister spent a lot of time talking about those kinds of things. But no, they don't do that. Because, as you say, people on the left will start attacking them. You know what? So what if people on the left start attacking you? I'd always thought this. You attack me on issues where the public 100% back me. You attack me because I'm proud of Australia. You attack me because I'm proud of our history. I'm proud of our achievements. I'm proud of what we do. You call me a racist and a fascist and a neo-colonialist, and fine. Go ahead, say all those things. But I think I can convince the public that love of country, with the four Greek forms of love of your community, love of your country, is a very important human sentiment. And denigrating it, and denigrating our ancestors, and denigrating our history, and characterizing our country as immoral or quasi-moral, and that's happened in Europe as well, and significantly in the United States. The public hate it. The public hate it. But if you stand up for patriotism, if you stand up for your country, you will be attacked. You will be viciously attacked by the liberal left. And I say, so what? So what? Go ahead, attack me, make my day. I'm prepared to have these debates. But even conservative politicians don't. I don't know in Australia whether I have seen Liberal and National Party leaders. Yes, I suppose I have from time to time making these kinds of points. They should make whole speeches about them. I know so-called reconciliation is important, but one of our core values is the equal values, and our values come from Christianity, or from the Judeo-Christian tradition, is that man and woman are made in the image of God, and we are all of equal value. We're not all equal, but we are all of equal value. And now we're going around saying, well, the people who got to Australia first are of more value than the people who got there second, third, or fourth. I don't know when your Andersons, because there are a few Andersons around, when your Andersons arrived in Australia.
1838.
The same year as my ancestors did. It's the same year.
There you go.
We are of equal value. But what are we going to say to people whose ancestors arrived, or whose families arrived here in the 1950s or the 1980s? They're less than us, are they? They matter less. This is not the Australian way. So in the case of Australia, there was a huge revolt against they like to call themselves progressive. I think we should call them the left. A huge revolt against the progressive left in October last year, when over 60% of people voted down the voice. And there's a message there. People want to look after all people in Australia, including Indigenous people, but they don't want to give one group of people based on their heritage or based on their race or whatever it is, special privileges over others.
It seems to me that sometimes in Britain today, you get the feeling that the British feel that their original sin is colonisation. And we now have so many people who see the world through this sort of lens of victim and victim maker, victim and oppressor, coloniser and oppressed. And now we see that unbelievably extended to the state of Israel. You've said some very interesting things about that. I think I heard you say something to the effect, and I thought it was very profound, so I hope I've quoted it reasonably well when I've referred to it, that there are, broadly speaking, say 85 or so countries that have Judeo-Christian origins in terms of their politics and their societies, and 50-something that are broadly Muslim. There's one Jewish state, and guess which one we say should be abolished. Have I got you right? I think you made that point. I thought it was a pretty powerful point.
You're completely right. This is an extrapolation of critical theory that the whole world. It comes from the concept. I think some will argue it comes from sort of Feuerbach and Hegel through Marx. This notion that society is about power, that explains how society works, and there are power relationships, and there's imbalance in those relationships. And I'm left-wing, so I think I need to rebalance those relationships. and fight for the people who are, if you like, less powerful against the powerful. So in Marx's time, this was the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, as we know. So that's the critical theory has sort of extrapolated all of this into something different, which is that, I mean, in a sense, it's more toxic than Marxism because it's extrapolated it to issues like race. So if you are non-white in Britain, you are deemed to be a victim. And if you are white, you are, they love the term white privileged. Yeah, and it's just outrageous, this. But everybody who's white, not just some people, everybody, which is, I think about 83% of the population, they're all, not surprising you get a lot of white people in Britain. They are all privileged. And therefore, to be privileged is to be condemned, by the way. And people of colour are all oppressed. I mean, and this is so divisive. Some people of colour, by the way, are very rich, and some people of colour are very powerful. I mean, not least the most powerful person in the country is a person of colour, the Prime Minister. And so it's a complete nonsense. It's intellectually nuts. That's what I think it is. It's just completely nuts. But what is incredible is the way politicians have either embraced it or are frightened to criticise it because of the reaction they'll get. Of course, you get called a racist. I mean, I said this in Australia during the Voice campaign. So the focus of the pro-voice people was Indigenous people living in remote communities. What percentage of Indigenous people live in remote communities? It's something like 15%. Don't hold me to that, but it's something like 15%. And I appreciate there are all sorts of issues that need to be dealt with there. I visited the remote communities and you know them incredibly well. You had some of those communities in your electorate, I remember you talking about them in Cabinet. So they were represented, by the way, in Cabinet by you on many.
Absolutely. And I did care about them. I particularly cared about the kids.
Yeah, of course. But we're going to set up a consultative body for all Indigenous people. What I used to say, including people with Indigenous heritage. I mean, that might not be 100% of their heritage, but Indigenous heritage who live in Vaucluse or in Toorak. I mean, who are millionaires, who are incredibly successful, powerful people in Parliament who are Indigenous. We need to set up a consultative body that embraces all of them just on the basis of their racial heritage. I mean, it's so divisive to run a society like that. So in the UK, I think the public have just had enough of it. The sort of continual denigration of the vast majority of people who are white, some of whom are poor, some of whom have real trouble with literacy and high incidence of criminality, poor living standards, poor health. A lot of white people are in that situation, not just people of colour. And some people of colour, as I've said, are powerful, such as the Prime Minister. And they're, the Home Secretary, he is a person of colour. The Business Secretary, Trade and Business Secretary, she's a person of colour. It's not the issue what colour they are. And it's a characteristic over which they had no say, they were born with. There are different issues about education and opportunity and so on. But I think this is just toxic to divide the world up on the basis of races. And this sort of colonial legacy, it's all the fault of colonialism, everything's the fault. So you're a brutal dictator, totally corrupt in an African country, and the country's going to the dogs. And you say, well, the reason we're having problems in our country is because of a colonial legacy. Nothing to do with me, officer. I mean, seriously, we shouldn't be tolerating this anymore. There should be, I mean, my big point, excuse me, talking so passionately about this, but my big point is that people on the mainstream of society and their political leaders, the realists, if you like, the common sense people, they've allowed themselves to be browbeaten by the progressive left. They're frightened. They're frightened of the progressive left. They're frightened of some headline in the Guardian or the Melbourne Age or someone condemning them as a racist. They're frightened.
And this
not all of them. The Centre Price was not frightened.
And this fear leading to the lack of leadership that you're alluding to seems to me, particularly in this country, to have been horrendously highlighted by the failure to condemn the rising tide of anti-Semitism. I find that the oldest and ugliest form of racism of all. And the idea that the people of Israel are colonisers intent upon turning others in the region into victims, firstly overlooks the fact that there have always been Jews in that part of the world, always, for all of effective recorded history, as I understand it. I mean, the other enormous problem with that is, if you have any understanding of history, to describe the Jewish people as oppressors, has anyone been more oppressed than the Jews? Was anyone subjected to greater oppression during the last century than the Jewish people? And this lack of understanding of history and willingness to allow people to hide their anti-Semitism behind tut-tutting about Israel as though the two can be separated. I mean, of course you can be free to criticise Israeli policies, but I would put it that many people in the current climate are hiding their anti-Semitism behind saying we disapprove of Israel. I mean, what is Israel meant to do? Why are we not calling on Hamas to end the butchery and the bloodshed? Why are we not calling on them?
I was on a radio program in the UK debating this very recently, and they were saying there should be a ceasefire. And I say this, there indeed should be a ceasefire. You're quite right. And when Hamas surrender their weapons and hand over the hostages, there will be a ceasefire. There will be no more war. That's all Hamas needs to do. They need to say, we will not shoot Jews. We will not attack Israel. We will not fire rockets into Israel. We will just live in peace and prosperity in Gaza. And we will release I'm not sure how many hostages are left, but over 100. We will release all the hostages, and then all of the fighting will stop overnight. It would stop by lunchtime today if Hamas agreed to that. But no, all the pressure is on Israel. Netanyahu, will he agree to a ceasefire or won't he agree to a ceasefire? Honestly, if a group of people in a territory adjacent to Australia, I daren't name one of those territories because it will create offence, because it wouldn't happen. It's hypothetical. But on a territory adjacent to Australia, kidnapped Australians and butchered and massacred and raped Australian citizens, what would we do about that? What would we do? Would we say, well, there should be a proportionate response, and so we'll go and rape some of their people and butcher some of their people? Well, actually, we'll butcher and rape exactly the same number that they butcher the bars, and we'll take exactly the same hostages. Don't be absurd. Of course we wouldn't. We would do them over something horrible. And people need to know that. If you attack us and brutally treat our people like that, and you try to destroy our whole country, we'll finish you off. It will be as simple as that. I mean, finishing off Hamas's military capability is what I'm referring to. So I mean, the feckless West is out there putting pressure on the Israelis, but not Hamas. They're not out there every day expressing outrage about Hamas continuing to fight. I mean, in the last 24 hours before we've done this podcast, there's been some fighting around a hospital, Al-Sharifa, I think it's called, the hospital, fighting around the hospital. I stop and I think to myself, and then the media all say there are Israeli tanks there and Israeli Defense Force soldiers have been shooting. Shooting at what? People have been shooting at them from the hospital. People are attacking the Israelis and people who are in the hospital. I mean, it's obviously a war. You can't expect just one side, the Israelis, to carry all the burden. I mean, but this goes to what you're saying. This goes to anti-Semitism. People aren't demanding that President Zelensky, who, we're on his side, we've talked about that. President Zelensky should be careful with his targeting when he's attacking targets in Donbass and Crimea and so on, and touching, and they hit a civilian target. No, not the Ukrainians. People don't seem to care too much about the absolute brutality that is going on in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Huge numbers of people have been killed in the DRC, particularly in the western part of the DRC, eastern part of the DRC. Huge numbers of people, but nobody cares about that. All they care about is the Israelis attacking the Palestinians. And this goes to exactly what you're saying. I hadn't realized it was still so deep, that anti-Semitism runs very deep in all our societies. Huge onus is put on Jewish people. And in this particular case, on the Israelis, huge pressure is being put on them. And I like the way the media say Netanyahu and his coalition are being put under increasing pressure by the West. I do know that their reaction to that is, I don't really care what the West says, and I don't really care what they think. They don't like Jews, and we're going to fight for our survival, because you're quite right. I mean, it's not just the Nazis and the Holocaust, although it is significantly that, but remember in the year 1900, what was the biggest Jewish city, or what city had the biggest Jewish population in the world? It was Baghdad. They were all expelled from Iraq. What about Alexandria? There was a huge Jewish community in Alexandria. Nasser just expelled them all. I mean, the Jews are pretty used to being expelled. I mean, in Gaza, when Ariel Sharon in 2005 withdrew Israeli occupation, to use the word that the left like to use, it withdrew Israeli occupation and the Israeli Defense Force from Gaza, they also forced some Jewish settlers out of Gaza. I mean, why didn't the Hamas and Al-Fatah people say at that time, oh, actually, it's fine for the Jewish people to live in Gaza. We don't have a problem with that. They'd be welcome to continue to live there. They have identity with the land and so on. So why wouldn't you let them live there? Well, apparently not. Apparently, Ariel Sharon had to drive them all out because the Palestinians wouldn't allow any Jews to continue to settle within what they see as their territory. So they have a no Jews policy. And of course, they want to destroy the whole of Israel, Hamas do, and Hezbollah. They want to destroy the whole of Israel and have a no Jews policy anywhere. So there are 9 million people in Israel. I think about 20% of them are Arabs. So a bit over 7, just in a moment do my maths, it's a bit over 7 million Jews in Israel. Where would those 7 million go if the chant from the river to the sea turned into a reality? They wouldn't be welcome in Palestine. You could be 100% sure of that. They weren't welcome in Iraq. They weren't welcome in Egypt. They weren't welcome in Gaza. They're not welcome in the West Bank. They're not welcome, full stop. They're not welcome. And so where would the 7 million go? Well, these people say they should go to Europe. Well, a lot of them are not remotely European. A lot of Jews come from Morocco. And they come from, as I've just been saying, from Iraq and Egypt and so on. And they couldn't go back to those places because they've already been driven out of them. So I'm hugely supportive of Israel. And the Jews have just got to knuckle down and fight. And we've got to support them.
Well, I agree with you. To bring this home, back to Australia for a moment, you reflected in some of the things that you've said that you'd experienced what I'd experienced globally, that Australia, which has always been seen as a good global citizen, strongly independent, resilient, outgoing, but laid-back people, and yet during COVID, we really allowed ourselves to be dictated to, particularly in Victoria, to an extraordinary degree. And that's really coloured the view of Australia, in my experience internationally. I've tended to counter by saying, well, give us some marks for being plucky and standing up as a mid-sized nation to Chinese coercion and interference. But it seems to me that we're busily backing off that as well, and allowing them to dictate the terms. They had their list of 14 grievances that they wanted fixed, and it seems that one by one the current government and the current mood, unfortunately, I suspect out of a lot of Canberra, including in the central agencies, is to say peace and stability with China at any price. You have a view?
Well, I think it's too early to be sure what the government, where the government will finally land on relations with China. I'm happy, as I was as the foreign minister, to engage with China, to trade with China. And we have to remember, we won't get rid of China and we won't get rid of the Communist Party in China. We have to coexist with China. So we need to find a way of doing that. So I don't think that there's a weak way of doing that, because I think weakness is provocative. I think there's a strong way of doing it, and that is having robust deterrence and a robust power balance in the Indo-Pacific region. We can't allow the region to become a Chinese lake, sort of Monroe Doctrine, Chinese Monroe Doctrine for East Asia, because that will be hugely destabilizing. There will be all sorts of catastrophic consequences that would flow from that. So we've got to stop that. And Australia has been really successful, in my view, in working with not just the Americans, of course, and the Japanese, to some extent with the Koreans, but working with the Indians as well. And this through the Quad, through AUKUS, through just reinforcing the American alliance network in the region, I think has done a great deal to underwrite the power balance that the region needs. So that's something that has on the whole been done pretty well. I mean, a lot of that was done by the Morrison government, the Abbott government, the Turnbull government. They all made a contribution to that, not just the present government. And you're right. I think Australia won a lot of plaudits for the way it stood up to China, despite the economic sanctions. And I think it's one of the reasons why they haven't changed their strategy, but why China has changed its policy, its tactics on engaging with countries that it sees as sort of allies of the Americans. They've decided to go softer on Australia. I mean, I always say with the Chinese, well, if I were the foreign minister today, and the Chinese foreign minister is in Australia, as I understand it, in the week that we're talking to each other, Wang Yi, I would say to him, look, it's like this. We're happy to trade with you. We're happy to have two-way investment. But you have to understand that there are sensitive parts of our economy where we will not allow you to invest, just as there are sensitive parts of China's economy where you won't allow us to invest. I can't imagine you allowing us to invest in Chinese telecommunications networks and so on. Well, we feel the same way. It makes us feel a bit insecure. So we're going to just have those restrictions and on where you can invest and some restrictions on trade, but otherwise we're pretty much into wholesale engagement. And we expect you to adhere to the rule of law, not the rule of the jungle. So there's international law, and we expect you to adhere to international law. According to international law, the South China Sea is an open international waterway, and there should be freedom of navigation throughout the South China Sea. And it's as simple as that. We just expect you to acknowledge and adhere to the rule of law. So just make simple, clear points very politely to them and stick with that as a policy. They used to say to me, this alliance you have with the Americans and you keep doing things with the Americans, this is Cold War diplomacy. We don't need these sort of alliances anymore. You should abandon this alliance with the Americans. And I used to say to them, well, it's like this. It's like an individual. I'll choose my friends and you choose your friends, but you won't be choosing my people I can be friendly with, and I won't be choosing the people you can be friendly with. We have huge common interests and common heritage with the Americans. And common values. So we're always going to be together in a lot of different ways. And you just need to understand that. I mean, you have your own neighborhood and your own history and countries that you identify with more or less. And, you know, your relationship with Russia is your business. Your relationship with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and so on, that's your business. And our relationship with the Americans, that's our business. I think if you are polite but frank with them, they will understand. And you have to be careful what you say publicly in diplomacy. There's always a good way of putting things. I can't say I always hit the mark there. I sometimes didn't, but I sometimes did. And good diplomats are able to hit the mark with their public comments. So I think we can get the relationship right, but you won't get it right by fawning to them. And you're not going to allow them to invest in telecommunications in Australia, punta final. It's not going to happen. So you may as well be frank with them about that and explain to them why. We wouldn't want them to do too much spying on us. They probably will reciprocate that by saying, well, I hope you wouldn't be spying on us. They probably say that. Exactly. You smile.
Wow.
You have to think about these things. I mean, I remember, I won't say what the country was, but a Southeast Asian country with which we are very friendly got angry with us over some intelligence operation we had in that country that they exposed. And their foreign minister said to me, just hugely disappointed that Australia would engage in this sort of espionage in our country. I mean, it's very unfriendly. And I said to him, well, I mean, I'm not confirming or denying what you're saying, but I just note your representations to me. But I said, But mind you, it's reassuring to me from what you said that your country would never spy on Australia. That is reassuring to me. And you know what he did? He just smiled at me.
Yeah. I had an identical experience.
I know this country. I'm not naming it. I know this country very well. And I know they spy on Australia. Of course they do. We have very good relations with them, but they do a lot of spying.
Exactly. I've had exactly the same experience. Not with their foreign minister, but with a very intelligent observer in their capital city. Alexander, it's been fantastic. You've really given us some real meat to chew on. You've always had a very clear-sighted understanding of how the real world works and what you have to do to secure your freedoms and the interests of your people. And we've seen that writ large in your comments. So thank you very much indeed.
It's a great pleasure, John, and it's good to catch up with you again.